flight was supposed to be routine. A simple business trip from Seattle to Tokyo for an annual conference, with just enough time for a short nap and maybe a movie. I had been on so many flights that turbulence and delays felt like minor inconveniences. I even knew the menu on these international flights by heart. But nothing could prepare me for the way the world changed mid-flight. The first jolt was soft, almost like the plane had hit a pothole in the sky. I glanced at the woman next to me, her baby asleep in her arms. She didn't seem to notice. A few others around us stirred, some reaching for the flight attendant button. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, assuring us it was just minor turbulence. I leaned back, relaxed, convinced that everything would smooth out soon. Then the second jolt came, violent and sudden. It felt like the plane had been struck by something huge. My stomach dropped, and the overhead compartments rattled, some bursting open. A chorus of gasps filled the cabin as the plane shook again, more violently this time. People began to panic. The once calm flight attendants were now buckled into their seats, their faces drained of color. I could hear the engines straining, the hum turning into a disturbing roar. The seatbelt sign blinked repeatedly as the plane pitched, banking sharply to the right. A scream came from somewhere behind me, and the baby next to me started wailing. "We are experiencing some severe turbulence." The captain's voice cut through the chaos, but it no longer held the calm assurance it had earlier. "Please remain in your seats, with your seatbelts fastened." It wasn't the words, but the quiver in his voice that struck me. He didn't believe his own reassurance. Outside the window, the world had become a boiling mass of dark clouds. Flashes of lightning illuminated the churning sky, casting eerie shadows inside the cabin. The plane rocked violently again, throwing luggage, blankets, and pillows into the aisle. The woman next to me clutched her baby, whispering something under her breath. I gripped the armrests until my knuckles turned white. Then came the final blow, a blinding flash of light, followed by a deafening crack. The plane plummeted. People screamed. Some were crying, others shouted prayers. The sensation of freefall gripped my stomach, and the sight of everything, people, luggage, even the flight attendants, being tossed like rag dolls filled me with an unspeakable terror. An explosion erupted from the left wing. Through the window, I saw flames licking the metal skin of the plane. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, flailing uselessly in front of our faces. I couldn't hear anything now except the roar of the failing engines and the wind howling outside. The cabin lights flickered, and for one horrifying moment, everything went black. When the lights flickered back on, we were still falling. It felt like we were trapped in an endless descent, pulled by some invisible hand. I fought to breathe, my chest tight from fear, trying to remember the crash position they'd shown during the safety instructions. But it was too late for that. The ground was coming up fast, so fast. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the end. But then it came, a bone-shattering impact. My body lurched forward, restrained only by the seatbelt. The sound was immense, the sound of metal being torn apart, of trees snapping like toothpicks. The air was filled with smoke, screams, and the piercing groan of the plane breaking apart. Then, there was silence. When I opened my eyes, I was still alive. I could barely believe it. The cabin around me was a mangled wreck. The front half of the plane was gone, torn away in the crash, leaving us exposed to the elements. The tail section, where I sat, had somehow avoided total destruction. The woman beside me was unconscious, her baby still wailing in her arms. I fumbled with my seatbelt, my fingers numb and clumsy. My whole body ached, especially my head. Blood dripped down my forehead, but I was alive, somehow impossibly alive. Stumbling to my feet, I looked outside through the shattered remnants of the plane. Trees, endless trees. We had crashed in a dense jungle, the foliage thick and suffocating. But something felt off. The sky was darker than it should have been. Even in the middle of the night, there should have been stars, but all I saw was a blanket of impenetrable blackness. Around me, other passengers were coming to, groaning and crying for help. I tried to focus, to gather my thoughts, but my mind kept drifting, consumed by the overwhelming shock of survival. A deep, unsettling feeling crawled over me. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in the air, like an invisible presence watching, waiting. I heard movement behind me and turned. One of the flight attendants was trying to free herself from the debris, her eyes wide with fear. She muttered something under her breath, but I couldn't hear her over the ringing in my ears. "What?" I croaked, my voice hoarse. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw what she was looking at. Past me, into the jungle. There was something moving, something huge. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now." I turned back to the jungle. The thick canopy seemed to shift, as if alive. The trees rustled, but there was no wind. The air was still, unnaturally so. Then I saw it. A shape, huge, indistinct, but definitely there. Moving just beyond the tree line, hidden in shadow. It was too large to be an animal. Couldn't be real, but it was moving closer. I didn't wait for a second look. Grabbing the unconscious woman next to me, I pulled her to her feet. The flight attendant was already running, limping toward the break in the wreckage where the jungle awaited. The others who were able to move followed her. As I dragged the woman through the wreckage, I could hear something, breathing, deep, guttural, and slow. It was coming from the jungle, getting closer with every second. I ran. Branches slapped against my face, and roots tripped me up as I plunged into the undergrowth. But the sound, that terrible sound, was still there, chasing me, hunting us. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just kept running, deeper into the jungle, with the echo of something monstrous closing in behind us. The descent was over. We had survived the crash, but I had the sickening feeling that we had crashed into something far worse than just the earth. We had landed somewhere we were not meant to be, and something in the jungle knew we were here. We plunged into the jungle, our footsteps muffled by the dense foliage, but the sounds behind us never faded. There was something in the trees, something massive, and I could feel it gaining on us with every ragged breath. The jungle floor was uneven, scattered with roots and thick undergrowth, but I refused to stop. I refused to look back. The flight attendant, whose name I still didn't know, was just ahead of me. The others had either gone in different directions or were lost behind us. I didn't have time to think about them. Survival was the only thought keeping me going. The woman I had dragged from the wreckage was semi-conscious now, stumbling along beside me, her face pale and smeared with dirt and blood. A terrible, low growl rumbled through the air, vibrating in my chest. I urged her to move faster, almost lifting her off her feet as we weaved between the trees. The thick canopy blocked out what little light there might have been, leaving us in a strange twilight, where shadows twisted and danced with every step we took. Felt like we had run straight into a nightmare. The jungle opened up slightly ahead, revealing a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The flight attendant stopped, panting, her eyes wide and frantic. I skidded to a halt beside her, still holding the other woman up. We both turned our heads slowly, fearfully, toward the direction we had come from. The growl came again, louder this time, more guttural. The trees shifted, branches snapping like bones. Then something appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was massive, a hulking shape, half hidden in shadow, but its outline was unmistakable, towering over the trees, moving slowly, deliberately. Its limbs were long, too long, and its body was coated in something slick and dark. I couldn't make out its features, but the sheer size of it, its presence, made my blood run cold. It didn't move like an animal. It was too calculated, too aware, and it was watching us. "What the hell is that?" the flight attendant whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I muttered, barely able to find my own voice. "We need to move. Now." But as we turned to run again, something changed. The jungle, which had been alive with the sound of insects and distant animal calls, suddenly went silent. Completely silent. I could hear my own breathing, the pounding of my heart in my ears. It was as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. The creature stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It was even worse than I had imagined. Its body was covered in matted fur, but not the kind you'd expect from an animal. This was slick with something wet, as if it had crawled out of the sea. Its head was grotesquely misshapen, like it had been twisted and pulled into something unnatural. And its eyes, oh God, its eyes were huge, gleaming with a sickly yellow light that pierced through the gloom and locked onto us with a terrifying intensity. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if I was paralyzed by the sight of it. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my body tremble with fear. The flight attendant grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my frozen state. "We can't stay here. We have to go." We stumbled backward, retreating into the trees again, but this time we were slower, disoriented. The creature took another step, then another, each movement deliberate and silent despite its massive size. The jungle closed in around us, and the deeper we went, the harder it became to see. The light had all but disappeared, replaced by an oppressive darkness that clung to us like a thick fog. We ran, tripping and stumbling over the uneven terrain, but no matter how fast we moved, the sound of that creature's presence never left us. It was like it was toying with us, letting us think we could escape before closing in again. Branches clawed at my face and arms, but I barely felt them. My mind was fixated on one thing: survival. The woman I had saved was gasping for breath, struggling to keep up, but I couldn't slow down. The flight attendant had pulled ahead, vanishing into the thick underbrush, and for a moment, I thought I had lost her. The thought of being alone in this nightmare sent a fresh wave of panic through me. Then I heard it, a scream, sharp, sudden, and cut off just as quickly. My heart stopped. "Help! Help me!" The flight attendant's voice cried out from somewhere up ahead, but it was distant, muffled by the oppressive jungle. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed for me to keep running, to leave her behind and save myself. But I couldn't. I couldn't just abandon her. I turned, guiding the injured woman to a small cluster of trees. "Stay here," I whispered, though I didn't know why I was bothering to hide. Whatever was chasing us, it wouldn't care about hiding places. She didn't argue, collapsing against the trunk, her breath ragged and uneven. I turned and ran toward the scream, crashing through the undergrowth, my heart pounding in my chest. "Where are you?" I shouted, my voice hoarse. There was no answer, just the oppressive silence of the jungle. Then I saw her. She was lying on the ground, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror. "It's here. It's coming." I rushed to her side, grabbing her arms and pulling her up. "We have to move. Now." But before we could take another step, a shadow fell over us. The creature was there, standing just beyond the trees, its enormous body blotting out the little light that remained. I could see it more clearly now, the glistening wet fur, the grotesque misshapen head, the way its limbs moved with unnatural fluidity. And those eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes. It stepped forward, its massive clawed hand reaching out toward us. The flight attendant let out a choked sob, clutching my arm in terror. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it at the creature, desperate to drive it away. The branch hit its arm with a sickening thud, but it didn't even flinch. It just stood there, watching us with those terrible eyes, as if amused by our pathetic attempts to fight back. Then, without warning, it lunged. The force of the creature's attack sent us both sprawling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flight attendant and pulling her up with me. My mind was racing, trying to find some way out, but there was nothing. Just the endless jungle and the creature that was now closing in on us. I turned to run, but the flight attendant stumbled, falling to the ground again with a cry of pain. She clutched her leg, tears streaming down her face. "Go!" she gasped. "Just go." I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't leave her. Couldn't, but the creature was getting closer, its massive form looming over us. I could feel the heat of its breath, smell the rank, wet stench that clung to its fur. There was no time to save both of us. I made my choice. I turned and ran, leaving her behind. Her screams echoed through the jungle, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I kept running, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The screams eventually stopped, swallowed by the silence of the jungle. I was alone. By the time I collapsed against a tree, my entire body shaking from exhaustion, the sun had begun to rise, casting weak light through the canopy. I could still hear the occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, but the creature's presence felt distant now. For the moment, I was safe. But as I sat there, panting and shaking, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, still hunting us. And the other survivors, were scattered across this island, alone and unaware of the danger they were in. I couldn't stay here, not if I wanted to survive. I had to find the others. The jungle grew denser the further I moved, as if the island itself was swallowing me whole. The thick underbrush tangled around my legs, each step becoming more of an effort than the last. The humid air pressed down on me, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. Every sound, from the distant call of birds to the rustling of leaves, made me flinch. The creature, whatever it was, still lurked in the shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was toying with me, letting me think I was safe just to drag me back into its nightmare. I pushed forward, my body aching from the crash and the relentless pace I'd set for myself. Every part of me screamed to stop, to rest, but I couldn't afford the luxury. The creature could return at any moment, and the other survivors, the ones who hadn't fled into the jungle, needed help. There had to be others. There had to be. I stumbled through a particularly thick patch of undergrowth, pushing aside vines and branches, when I suddenly heard something that wasn't the jungle's usual sounds. Voices. Human voices. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Carefully, I crept forward, pushing through the last line of trees until I came to another clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, were 3 other survivors huddled together. They were crouched around a makeshift fire, though the flame was pitiful, barely more than embers. 2 men and a woman. Their clothes were torn and dirty, faces pale and drawn from exhaustion. I stepped forward, my sudden movement causing them to snap their heads in my direction. For a moment, they stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, ready to bolt. "It's okay," I called out, raising my hands to show I meant no harm. "I'm one of the survivors from the plane." They relaxed slightly, though suspicion still clouded their faces. One of the men, a tall, lanky figure with a deep gash on his forehead, stood and approached me cautiously. "You're alive," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. We thought everyone else was dead." "There are others," I said, my voice shaky. I found a woman and there was a flight attendant, but something took them." The man's expression darkened, and I could see the other 2 survivors exchange nervous glances. The woman spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. "We've seen it. We've heard it in the trees." "What is it?" I asked, desperate for some kind of answer, something to explain what was happening. "What is that thing?" The man shook his head. "We don't know. It's been hunting us since the crash. We've tried to keep the fire going, but it doesn't seem to care. It just waits. Watches." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "There's no way off this island, is there?" The other man, shorter and stockier, looked up from where he was tending to the fire. "We don't even know where we are. No one's coming to save us."